You turn, please, to Ephesians, chapter 1 and verse 19. Ephesians 1 and 19. And what is the immeasurable greatness of his power in us who believe? What is the immeasurable greatness of his power in us who believe? And then there's one clear example there of it in John chapter 11. And it's John 11 and verse 43. When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with bandages, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. And that's part of the immeasurable greatness of his power. And that's what Jesus was able to do, destroy death, And that death is destroyed now, and he is in each one of us and is able to do the same thing. That's the immeasurable greatness of his power. It might be good to notice that often we get preoccupied with proving that that power is in us. And it's probably good to see that that approach, in a way, destroys the whole possibility of that power, because it's us trying to prove that that power is in us. And so you remember years ago we got caught up with, all kinds of silly things, foot lengthening and all kinds of antics that we went to prove that that power was within us. And it's still possible for us to get preoccupied with proving that that power is in us. And in a way, we're showing our lack of belief that that power is there by our attempts to prove that it's within us. It's good to see that these instances that you read of that immeasurable greatness of power always come in incidental ways. Jesus doesn't set out to raise Lazarus from the dead. In fact, the whole story indicates very clearly that it was the sisters called him to the situation, and indeed, you remember, he did not come right at that moment. And so it was the circumstance that gave rise to the need for the power. And it seems to me that that's something that we need to see ourselves. It's in the normal pattern of our life and the normal obedience that we're giving to Jesus that we will see the immeasurable greatness of that power. And certainly I would testify, whether you explain my little experience medically or whatever way, to me it seemed to be a miracle, and it certainly wasn't something that you planned. It certainly wasn't something that you went into knowing, yes, God's power is going to be manifested in this situation. You simply went on in the normal course of events, and you met certain circumstances, and you walked on in them, and God made the immeasurable greatness of his power available to you at that time. And it does seem to me that part of our relaxation is in that kind of attitude, that we don't seek to prove the immeasurable greatness of his power, and therefore to prove our apostolic character or our Christian faith, but we go on in the normal pattern of obedience to him day by day. Now, maybe there's a clue there, because most of these people were told to do certain things by God himself, and they did them. And we probably need to make sure that we are obeying the little things that he's showing us to do, if that power is going to be made manifest. But it seems to me it's going to come that way. And if there's going to be anything achieved on things like the web or the newsletter or the radio or anything that we do, or our businesses, it's going to come through God manifesting his immeasurable greatness of power when he determines that is the right time. And we are going to be required simply to walk obediently day by day. Now, there's another example of it if you look at Luke chapter 7 and verse 14. And it seems to show the same kind of situation. You remember Luke 7 and verse 14. It's page 896. And he came and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, Young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And he gave him to his mother. And again, it's Jesus destroying death and raising a person from the dead. And so there's an immeasurable greatness to the power. It doesn't have limitations. It isn't limited to this life. It is able to turn death round. And yet Jesus did it in a kind of incidental situation, because you can see verse 11, soon afterward he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the city, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, Do not weep. And he came and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, Young man, I say to you, arise. So it was an incidental situation. Jesus was going with a great crowd of his own disciples and the people who were interested in what he was doing. And as he was going in, this other crowd were coming out. And he dealt with the situation there. So it seems it will be the same for us. Whenever we set out to prove that power or to demonstrate it, we will, in a sense, be making it impossible for God to manifest it. It is God's doing. God is the one that has destroyed death in Jesus, that has made death of no power, and it is him that will choose when to manifest that in this present world. And when we try to control that, we are, in a way, trying to do what old C.S. Lewis said, you're trying to work mastery, the old Middle Ages idea of mastery, mastery of the occult powers, or of the powers of the Spirit. And in a way, we're trying to do that, and God will always withdraw himself from that kind of attitude. So it's probably good in our own heads to be clear now, when and how will this greatness, immeasurable greatness of God's power be manifested? Well, it'll be manifested incidentally by him when he chooses, as we go about the business that he's given us to do and as we obey him. And there's another example of it in Mark 4 and verse 39. Equally evident that there is no limitation to this power, that it is immeasurable greatness of power, that there's no limit. It's not limited by death, and it's not limited even by what seem to be the impersonal forces of nature. In Mark 4 and verse 39, and he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? And they were filled with awe and said one to another, Who then is this that even wind and sea obey him? But all in an incidental situation. You can see verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, Let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And it doesn't matter what way you look at it. It doesn't matter whether you think, Jesus somehow could read the clouds and could read that there would be a storm. Then his response wasn't along those lines, you can see. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great storm of wind arose, and the winds beat into the sea so that the boat was already filling. So all the evidence of something that the person didn't plan, it wasn't a planned demonstration of power. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care if we perish? So it is all the marks of just incidental situation in which God manifests his immeasurable greatness of power. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And it goes on, of course, when it gets into those of us who believe. Those are the instances in Jesus himself, but the instances in those of us who believe is Acts 3. And it's verse 6. And it's again the same kind of situation. Acts chapter 3 and verse 6. It's page 949. 949. But Peter said, I have no silver and gold, but I give you what I have. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk. And he took him by the right hand and raised him up, and immediately his feet and ankles were made strong. And leaping up he stood and walked and entered the temple with them, walking and leaping and praising God. And all the people saw him walking and praising God, and recognized him as the one who sat for alms at the beautiful gate of the temple. And they were filled with wonder and amazement at what had happened to him. But the situation came about not through Peter and John going out determined to manifest this power, but through them just will. In verse 3, now Peter and John were going up to the temple at the hour of prayer, just obeying their commitment to devotion, the 9th hour. And a man lame from birth was being carried, whom they laid daily at the gate of the temple, which is called Beautiful, to ask alms of those who entered the temple. Seeing Peter and John about to go into the temple, he asked for alms. And Peter directed his gaze at him with John and said, look at us. And he fixed his attention upon them, expecting to receive something from them. But Peter said, I have no silver and gold, but I give you what I have. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk. But it's the immeasurable greatness of God's power that is available. Just one other instance, the poor guy who fell asleep during an exciting sermon. Acts 20 and verse 9. And it's page 967. Acts 20 and verse 9. And a young man named Eutychus was sitting in the window. He sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and embracing him said, do not be alarmed, for his life is in him. And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them in a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the lad away alive, and were not a little comforted. And so it's another situation where Paul did not plan to bore the guy to death, but the fellow fell asleep and fell off, And so it does seem that the immeasurable greatness of God's power has no limitations either by death or by the powers of nature, and that's the power that is within us. But it seems to me our faith is found not in trying to prove that it's there, but in knowing that it is available, and God will make it available when he needs to do that. And of course the key to the whole thing is that it's because of the one who is within us, Jesus himself. And it's his power. Let's pray.